Welcome everyone to High Plains Library District's virtual author talk. Tonight we are pleased and honored to speak with Libby Copeland, author of The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, which was published in March of this year by Abrams Press and is available for purchase through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Bookshop. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point and just say a little more about Libby and The Lost Family. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author writing from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for the American culture broadly. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. And the Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Please note there will be a question and answer period at the end of our event tonight. If you think of questions for Libby during our discussion, you can type them in the question area on the control panel on your screen, and we'll hold those until the question and answer period. So at this time, Libby, if you'd like to turn on your webcam. There we are. Okay. Let's see. Can I hear you? I think I can. Excellent. So welcome, Libby Coleman, to the High Plains Library District.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Charlie.
Excellent. So, as someone once said, the best place to start is at the beginning. So let's talk about your writing process. How did you come to write The Lost Family?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for over 20 years, and the stories that were always appealing to me, the most appealing, were the intimate stories of what drives people, their inner motivations, what sort of shapes their identities, and ordinary folks in extraordinary circumstances. And that coincided with an interest in science writing and the social sciences, human behavior, the cognition and how we think. And it all kind of came together a few years ago when I was in conversation with an editor of mine at the Washington Post, which is a newspaper that I used to be on staff, and now I freelance for them. And we were talking about DNA testing and the fact that sometimes people enter into DNA testing with a kind of a casual curiosity. They want to find out what their ethnicity is, and they wind up with information that they sometimes weren't expecting to find. Right? They're somewhat unprepared to learn, for instance, that perhaps they're not genetically related to their dad. And that can have kind of ripple effects through a family, through the rest of a person's life. And I was really interested in how people deal with this, how it affects their sense of self, how it recreates their sense of identity, how they reach out to their genetic families and how their genetic families react, and what kind of factors influence how people react on the other side. I kind of dove into that. So I wrote a story for the Washington Post. It ran in 2017. It was on this topic. It was as much as you can tell in a newspaper story, which is, something, but not very much, because they're just kind of short newspaper stories by essence they are. But it was the reaction to this article that kind of blew me away and convinced me that this was something that really needed to be treated at greater length. And it was that I got hundreds of emails from people all over the world, in fact, not just in the US, but abroad. And they were saying, that was a really good story about DNA testing. But now let me tell you what happened to me. I took a DNA test 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 1 month ago, and it's reordered my life. And I want to share it because I'm still blown away, because I think it could help other people, because I'm still processing it, because I don't know what to do. What do you think? And these were people from every kind of demographic. And I just thought, okay, this is so much more than an article or many articles could really get across. This should be a book. And that's how The Lost Family started.
Great. Speaking of family stories, your book is framed by the story of one of these individuals, one of these genetic sleuths, Alice, whose last name I don't want to mispronounce. I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways. But Alice and her family has a great story, and I don't want you to spoil any of the surprises in that story because it's quite the roller coaster. But can you explain how her search provides a window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, sure. So her name is Alice Collins Playbook. And Alice is a genealogist and a very smart woman with a very scientific analytical mind, who tests back in 2012, which is in many ways sort of the dawn of the autosomal DNA testing era. So the type of DNA testing that can tell you about your ancestry and your family history, that is an industry that is 20 years old this year. But in the beginning, the tests that were available were very different from what's available now. They were more telling you about your ancient migration path, your ancient genetic origins, not so much what they can tell you now, which is your immediate relatives on your maternal and your paternal sides, and that pie chart, that ethnicity estimate everyone wants, that tells you where your various branches of your family came from, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. So autosomal DNA testing came along about a decade ago, so about halfway into the life of this industry so far. And 2012 is when Ancestry, which would become the biggest player in this space, unveiled their autosomal DNA test. And Alice was a genealogist who was already on, subscribing to Ancestry and already on their mailing list. And so she was offered a trial of this DNA test. They were still testing it out. It was in beta, and she didn't know what to expect, but she was like, yeah, I want to know more, about my family's Irish heritage. Like, maybe this will help me break through some brick walls. Now, the thing to know about Alice is she comes from a large Irish Catholic family. There's 7 Collins siblings. They have a very strong sense of ethnic identity and ethnic pride, knowing that both of their parents come from primarily Irish immigrants. So when she tested, she was expecting to find a pie chart that was pretty much all from one area, which was the British Isles. And it was going to be mostly Irish, and it was going to have a little British and Scottish thrown in. And she knew what she was going to find. Like most people who got a surprise, she was certain what she was going to find, and then it wasn't what she found, right? And what she found was that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is the term for Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe, who lived together, loved together, married, and kept within their own communities, separate from where the European communities that they were in, and as a result have a unique genetic signature that is different from an Irish, person with Irish descent, their genetic signature. So Alice, of course, first thinks that, this test is they're not ready for prime time. She writes Ancestry a nasty note. She says, you guys don't know what you're doing. Your science is enough. And also wants to investigate, right? She thinks, well, maybe it's true. Let me test with another company. She tests at 23andMe. And the second test confirms the first. And she starts to try to figure this out. And because she is a very methodical person, and because she has a background in she happens to just have the perfect background for this. She's worked her entire life in data processing and information systems. And so she knows exactly how to deal with large amounts of data. She's not intimidated by it. And it turns out what she needs to do is kind of wrestle this data to the ground, because what she is doing is trying eventually, ultimately, to figure out how she got her story so wrong based on the literally thousands of relatives that she finds identified as genetic cousins in the various databases. And she eventually tests with multiple companies. So she's comparing herself to other people based on shared genetic segments down to the precise length of centimorgans that they share. It's incredible work. It's basically like hunting for a needle in a haystack, and it takes her 2.5 years to solve her story. So what's interesting about Alice? Alice happens to be really fun, really funny, really warm, really just someone that is lovely and smart and you want to spend a lot of time with. But what's also very compelling about her story is that it is not the expected explanation. So typically somebody in this situation who tests and they get half their pie chart isn't what they expect, they're going to most likely be learning that they're the product of a non-paternity event, or NPE. Sometimes that's translated as not parent expected. Sometimes it's called MPE for misattributed parentage experience. Why am I throwing these acronyms at you? Basically, this is really pretty common, right? And the fact that there's so many acronyms and euphemisms should tell you that this is something that is not unusual, and it is happening to, a minority of people, but a significant subset of people who test are going to find out they're not genetically related to their dad or one of their parents, but typically their dad. And in fact, that's not the explanation for Alice, which is pretty surprising. It's also not the case that she's adopted. It's not the case that she's donor conceived. And it's not the case that she comes from a community that hid their genetic ancestry or had it hidden from them. So at one point she, comes up with this theory that maybe she came from a group of Jews who hid their, religious background and pretended to be Irish, or maybe they were Irish Jews who sort of forgot over generations that they were Jewish. So she investigates all these theories, and it turns out to be none of them. And ultimately, her explanation goes back 100 years. And one of the amazing things about reporting The Lost Family was I got to go back and do that historical research a century, in the past. But why Alice's story is so great and such a great sort of container and vehicle for the book is because it allows me to tell many other stories within hers, because at each moment where I sort of talk about the possibility that she's exploring, that maybe she's the product of a non-paternity event, I get to tell you and show you what, different stories of people who experience non-paternity events, some of whom were people who reached out to me after that original Washington Post article ran, and some of whom I just found through my reporting. And the reason I wanted in particular a story with twists and turns and a lot of other stories contained within it is because I knew I was writing, a book of science for a mainstream audience. And I really wanted it to be accessible. I wanted a narrative that was true, but was going to pull the reader through the book as if it was fiction, right? And Alice's story is so compelling that it achieves that. It basically makes the book into a kind of a whodunit, but the whodunit is existential. So anyway, that's my sort of explanation of Alice and her centrality in the genetic genealogy story that I'm trying to tell.
And speaking as a reader, I can testify, like I said before, it's kind of a roller coaster because, as you said, at each point where she's trying to figure out what happened or what's going on, like you said, there's one theory, and that does give you the chance to step aside and say, here are some other examples of that situation. But as a reader, it's like reading, like you said, not only a whodunit, but a suspenseful one where you get to the end of the chapter and you think, okay, I think I've got this figured out. And then you go off to the side for a bit and you're like, all right, I'm going to find out what's happening next. So, and it keeps you on that roller coaster ride to the very end. I particularly liked the fact that it gave you a chance when you were talking about her Ashkenazi heritage, just the technical difficulty because of the cohesion in that group to separate out which genetic cousin was really a close genetic cousin genealogically, as opposed to just through the DNA. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, it was an opportunity to kind of explore, some of the unique challenges for people of Jewish descent, African American community. Different groups have their different challenges when they're doing genealogy and genetic genealogy, and so that's really interesting to kind of explore. And I'll just say this because it literally just happened. So one of my favorite suspense writers is a woman named Tana French. And I've read every single one of her books, and I'm like a ridiculous fan of hers. I just found out that The Guardian puts together their list, the Guardian newspaper in England, they put together their list of the best books of 2020. And they tapped a bunch of authors to be their panel, and she chose my book. For one of the best books of 2020.
Brilliant. Congratulations.
Thank you. It
That's
just
amazing.
happened. So I'm like really excited about it because like when I was writing it, I was trying to channel Tana French, right? And she's writing fiction, but if you don't know her, she writes these incredible detective stories, right? And they're mysteries, and they're kind of unfolding over the course of the book, and that by the end they solve the mystery, right? But you're like on the edge of your seat the whole time, and there's a lot of interiority, there's a lot of psychology to the characters, and there's a lot of landscape and all of that. I can't recommend her books highly enough. But so, what I was trying to achieve was a little bit of that feeling only with a true story. And I was so like sort of pleased and thrilled that she, she sort of like got the vibe of what I was trying to achieve, which was like a whodunit. That's basically, and I will say, like, I think, as Americans, we have become seekers. We have genealogy is huge right now, so big. It's never been so big. And we've never had so many resources at our disposal. We've never had so many people be able to DNA test or access literally billions of records. So, Americans happen to be a nation that assimilated. Many of us, most of us immigrated from someplace else and assimilated, right? Or came here and assimilated through choice or not through choice. And so we've lost, many of us, this connection to the past. And I think we're in this moment where we're looking back, and we're all a little bit on a whodunit quest, because we're trying to understand how the past informs who we are, and all the things about the past that maybe we didn't know about, that now we're rediscovering in this particular moment, and it's shaping us.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how you point out that, we have various types of family histories. There's the actual genealogical record that we can sometimes trace through documents, and things that we can find out through DNA testing, genetic testing. But then there's the family narratives, the stories that our families tell themselves and each other and others about who their family is and what their family is. And do you have any thoughts on how those sort of end up colliding from time to time?
Yeah, I mean, particularly I would say in the DNA moment, well, there's a couple of the kind of ways in which this can play out. I mean, one of the most commonplace narratives that you hear from people going into DNA testing is they're looking to confirm Native American ancestry. And they're often not finding it for a variety of reasons. It's too far back to be detectable. It was never there in the first place, being among the reasons. And the reasons it was never there in the first place, and the reasons why people were told that it was there, are complicated aspects of our history. Yeah. But so there's definitely that these kind of collisions of DNA and the narratives that we were told that we were handed down from our greats. And then on a more immediate level, there's the collision between what you believe about your nuclear family and what DNA can reveal. So for instance, in the book, I tell the story of a woman who learned that she was adopted through DNA testing. Now, that's not that common. And nowadays, at least, most people who are adopted are at the very least told they were adopted, if not know who their identity of their birth parents are. Yeah. And so they're typically using DNA to find their parents. If they want, if that's their goal, then they're going to be able to use DNA in that way. And it's important to know that the databases are so big at this point that in order to find a relative, like an aunt, like an uncle, like a first cousin, to identify them, or a parent, that person doesn't need to have tested and have spit into a vial in order for you to be able to identify them, potentially. You can do it from mutual cousins. And so that's a very important thing to know about. But so, people, for instance, this woman, Linda, she discovers, in fact, that she is adopted through a test, which was something that nobody had told her. And her mother didn't tell her, for complicated reasons. Her brothers didn't tell her. Her good friend who knew, who was a relative, didn't tell her. And then she began the process of kind of reaching out to the genetic kin on both sides. When she reaches out to her genetic father, his response is, it's nice to talk to you and all, but like these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. Right? Because, yeah. It's like evidence of relationships I had before I was married. It's just like awkward, right? And he doesn't really want anything to do with her. And so she's kind of heartbroken, and she's okay. So she reaches out to her maternal side. Now her bio mom had just died 6 months before. So unfortunately for Linda, she's not able to ask her mom the question that she most wants to know, which is, did you look for me? Did you wonder about me? Which is, the most vulnerable kind of aching of the soul question that she'll never be able to have answered, which is really, really hard. Her sisters on her mom's side, her half sisters, don't know about her. And she's in this situation where she is basically like, hi, I exist. Your mom had a child, and that, and arranged for that child to be adopted, before, you came along, or before she was married to your dad. And I'm here and I want a relationship with you. And the daughters are like, totally blown away, because presumably because their narrative of their mother is not one that includes this, right? And they're in grief for a woman who just died. And so you see these collisions between my truth and your truth, between my existence and your sacred narrative about a person who just passed away. And how do those two things reconcile? Sometimes they can't. Sometimes, maybe in the future, if both parties are able to tread really carefully, and there's a relative who can act as a mediator, maybe, right? But a lot of times, no, and emotions are running high. And in this situation, ultimately, what Linda got back was, complete rejection from her maternal side, and from her paternal side, eventually, a letter from her dad's lawyer saying, please don't contact my clients anymore. And so she was left kind of, with this feeling of being really rejected. And you can tell someone, don't take it personally. This isn't about you. This is about the nature of the secret of the fact that you exist, right? The way in which you came into this world. But man, does that feel personal. And it's heartbreaking for someone like her.
I was struck by how many, not surprisingly, a lot of the stories that had to do with these surprises, a lot of them are just heartbreaking. But you kind of run us through the gamut of emotions there, because there were also some stories that were really incredibly heartwarming. Of thinking of the woman who, if I remember correctly, this is early in the days of sort of combining genetic genealogy, where they're doing the genealogy work with the limited genetic information they have. And she thinks that she's found her biological family, and creates a relationship with that family, particularly one family member, only to find out long after that she is actually not related to them. But the fact that they maintained that relationship, that was really, really, really nice.
Yeah. So I wonder if maybe the story you're thinking of is the story of Roberta and her brother Dave.
Yeah.
And that story, if anyone wants to check it out, it was excerpted in the Washington Post. So if you want to just read that standalone story, you can just look up Libby Copeland and Roberta and Dave in the Washington Post, and you can find it. And it's a really lovely story. What I found over and over, I can't begin to say most stories go like this or most stories go like that. It's all anecdotal. And I've spoken with or emailed with hundreds of people, but I have no way of scientifically knowing, are the majority of the stories happy endings, and the minorities rejections. It's sort of hard to say, and a lot of it is self-selected. So, but I like this, I tried to tell a kind of a careful mix, a balance, because I didn't want to weight it one way or the other. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's not always these happy reunions. So sometimes you can walk away with the sense that that's the case, because I think that there's somewhat of a bias in the news industry for the happy stories, because they're just a bit easier to tell, and they have an ending that you can wrap up with a bow and then you can walk away. And that's certainly not the reality. But there are these really heartwarming stories, and I do think they're important to tell, because I think they point the way forward for the rest of us, right? Because the databases are really big and they're only going to grow. And that means that more people are going to find out things about their families aren't what they thought, and they're going to have to grapple with the outcome of that. And if we can learn from the wisdom of people who have been there, and they can say, this is how I managed to be open-hearted about it, even though it was painful. This is how I managed to, embrace my family, even though it was some difficult conversations were involved with this one. I think we can all learn from that. And, what I've found over and over, and this is true for understandings of our ethnic identity, and this is true for understandings of our family, is that people are not sort of binary or flat in terms of their understanding. They are more expansive. So we tend to reduce these conversations about family and about ethnicity to things like nature versus nurture. Is it biology or is it experience? Is it, what your genes tell you, or is it what you grew up with? Well, it's yes, both, of course, right? And to get into these kinds of rankings is crazy making. And so the story of Roberta and Dave is like this wonderful kind of parable about how DNA is, as Roberta puts it, she puts it the best. She says, DNA isn't everything. DNA is not love. Right. And her relationship with this man who she considers her brother, who is her brother, and they have shared family, you know, they're just not genetically siblings, is so important to her and so important to him. They really, really bond. She's the one who stands up and does the eulogy at his funeral, you know, and it doesn't matter, because what they've shared together, and their shared backgrounds and their kind of the bond that they have, the way that they've been there for each other, is just way more important than genetics. And so I love that story because I think it's both. I mean, people certainly, when they find out the truth of their biology, they do want to find their biological relatives. And this is not to discount the importance of that. That's very important. But it's also to make room for the fact that the man who raised you, if he's not genetically your father, is still your father, if you consider him your father, right? And each person kind of defines that for themselves. Some people define it differently, and each kind of seeker gets to make those definitions, I think.
Yeah. When I was beginning to read the book, I was thinking that maybe one of the morals of the story was, you don't know whether you're going to get a heartwarming story, you don't know whether you're going to get a heartbreaking story. And basically, we're putting that information out there and getting information back before we've really thought through what the implications are. And part of me thought, well, maybe this is the cautionary tale where maybe you shouldn't put that information out there. But as you said, we've hit this tipping point where you don't even need to put your own DNA sample in. There are enough people related to you that some of this information is going to come out anyway. And how do you see that? You know, as it is, like you mentioned, there are over 30 million, almost 35 million that have tested, which is over 10% of the population, which is just incredible. Where do you see that going once we get even more into that?
Yeah, so yes, 35 million people in the databases. And it's slightly less than 10% just because it's not all Americans. It's the majority, though, is Americans. So it's a significant, it's probably close to, if not 8% of the population, depending on how you estimate the number of Americans in there. The companies don't give that data. So that's based on estimate by a genetic genealogist. Third cousin matches appear to be the sort of important turning point where many relationships can be revealed through a third cousin DNA match. Third cousin match. So what does that mean? If you're looking for your genetic dad and you match in the system and you find a half sibling, you're good, right? Your job is pretty much done. You could contact that person and find out the identity of their dad, or you could probably just look them up, right? Because the digital trails, the breadcrumbs that we leave online about ourselves, make it incredibly easy to find out who someone's, you know, siblings and father and brother, you know, sisters and mom, and, you know, all sorts of things about them and their political leanings and everything else. So that's very easy. First cousin is often very easy. You know, if you're doing genetic genealogy from these kinds of close relationships, it can be fairly easy to figure out, at least, you know, if it's one of a set of brothers, that you know that it's one of 2 or 3 brothers, right? From a second cousin, that used to be kind of the gold standard for adopted people to find their birth parents. And that used to be very exciting if you could find a second cousin, because the databases were so small that it was kind of unusual to find a second cousin. And so search angels, who are these people who volunteer to help folks find their genetic kin, would say, if you can find a second angel, if you can find a second cousin, like, we're good, right? Like we can definitely figure it out from there. And third cousin is, you know, sort of right on the line, where if you can do enough digging and you're experienced, or you can have someone who's helping you who's experienced, who can do genealogical work, much of the time you can find that shared. So say your father, for instance, if you're looking for him through that third cousin match, and you have to go back in time and you have to kind of go way up to most recent common ancestor, and then you have to come back down and do reverse genealogy, but it's doable. So think about that. Think about the fact that you have third cousins who might be strangers to you, whose names you don't know, and their decision to test has implications for you, even if you never participated in this technology. So why does that matter? It means that we are all effectively pulled into a technology whether or not we choose to, right? You don't get to opt out. And it means that there's no more family secrets, right? This is literally the end of the genetic family secret, for better and for worse, and the situations kind of differ. And it's happening, ultimately maybe it may be sort of a good thing way off in the future when sort of the pain of this moment is past, that that people don't have their genetic origins hidden from them, and that there's more transparency. But this is a really painful moment, actually, and people are going through it without any kind of guidance or help. Other than what they can find in a kind of a grassroots way. There's a little bit emerging in the way of kind of formal support for them that's not coming from the companies, but kind of coming from the ground up. But it's still fairly limited. So that's like one sort of thing to keep in mind. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that even, the reason that these kind of things matter, even if you don't ever test. Yes, you could be pulled into a family kind of mystery, even if you never test. That's certainly within the realm of possibility. But more importantly, I think, even if you never take a DNA test, these questions about what informs our identities, what factors make us who we are, whether it's experience or whether it's genes, whether, who we would have been if we had known the truth all along, what would we have been like if we'd been raised by a different family? Like, these are things we all think about, right? Could I have turned out different? Could I have been, realized my ambitions if only, right? We're always asking ourselves those questions. Those are essential human questions. And I think that the DNA age makes them more dramatic and brings them home to more people. But we've always wondered about these things.
Yeah. One of the questions, speaking to that tipping point of all these relations being in the database, has to do with privacy considerations and how law enforcement, for instance, the case that people are most familiar with is the Golden State Killer from the book I'll Be Gone in the Dark. And that was an unsolved mystery cold case for decades. And then finally law enforcement solved it through DNA testing, but they did it through a commercial DNA database without informed consent to the people that were in there. What are the implications for this, particularly if this, I know the argument is, well, these are egregious capital crimes, the extreme measures for extreme situations, but what happens when the situations aren't as extreme?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This happened 2 years ago in April, I think, late April of 2018, when Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested and accused of being the Golden State Killer. And the Golden State Killer was somebody who is believed to have committed 50 rapes and 13 homicides. And he was a police officer, believe it or not, briefly a police officer, and he was never a suspect or a person of interest in the investigation. So, this DNA, which had been in police possession since the 70s and 80s, which is when this guy was committing his crimes, it had never been able to be used to solve the crime for a variety of reasons. First, the technology wasn't there. Then it was entered into the law enforcement databases, but it didn't produce a hit. And that has to do with the way that the DNA that's being used and the way that these law enforcement databases are being run. It's much less informative than what you can get out of your standard issue, genetic genealogy database. What I can find out as a genealogical researcher, right, is a lot more than a law enforcement officer can find out through CODIS, which is, the database that they're using, the law enforcement database. So that's pretty amazing. So the breakthrough that they had, and I should say that Joseph James D'Angelo was sentenced this summer, and he pled guilty to 13 homicides. So, the breakthrough that they had was to use genetic genealogy, right? The same methods that had been used by people who were adopted and looking for their genetic parents for whatever reason for, 8 years at that point. to just use it
Mhm.
for a criminal case, right? That was kind of the breakthrough. The techniques weren't new. It was just this idea of doing it for this purpose. And the database that they used was not one of the places where you can pay to spit into a vial and then get your results. So I'll just back up and give it a brief sense of the landscape. There are 4 major DNA testing companies. The biggest one is Ancestry with a database of 18 million, 23andMe, which has 12 million, MyHeritage, which has about 4 million, and the smallest and oldest is Family Tree DNA. They have somewhere between 1 and 2 million people in their database. But what was used was something called GEDmatch, which is a third-party publicly accessible website, which is so people take their information, their genetic information from a place like Ancestry, and they upload it to GEDmatch to compare with other kind of like-minded genealogical hobbyists, and use all sorts of tools and compare across databases. So somebody who tests at 23andMe and someone who tests at Ancestry, they can compare their DNA, their genetic information at GEDmatch. And that was, it was done without the people who were uploading their information there consenting or knowing that it was being used in this way. And then subsequently, the policy was changed at GEDmatch to kind of allow for people to opt into this use. So the outcry, though, that was produced was partly, one of, DNA shouldn't be used in this way unless people consent. Well, to some extent, that has been allayed by this opting in, opting out. And Family Tree DNA has a similar policy. They also now allow law enforcement access. But the greater question that legal experts still kind of wonder about and write papers about is, is this fair? Is this right for law enforcement to go on what they might characterize as a kind of a fishing expedition to find someone who would never otherwise be a suspect, piecing it together through relatives, right? And the question is, is that a kind of a violation of the spirit of the Fourth Amendment, or is that precisely why they want to do it? Because in cases like the Golden State Killer, this guy was never a suspect. And so potentially, you're pulling fewer people up into a dragnet because you're using DNA, which can kind of pinpoint someone rather than getting a whole list of persons of interest from various witnesses and tips, and then DNA testing all of them, right? So that's kind of the conundrum, is which is more invasive, which is consistent with the Fourth Amendment, and it hasn't really been tested in a rigorous way in a court of law, so we don't know where that's going to go. So it's a very interesting development for law enforcement, and they have now started using this kind of approach to solve mostly cold cases, mostly homicides and sexual assaults. And so kind of the low-hanging fruit, the worst of the worst. But there have been some sort of slippery slope cases. And so you do kind of wonder, is there going to be more in the way of, guardrails put in place for this? Because at the moment, there's not really much. And some of it comes down to just what the company says is okay, right? The company that is allowing law enforcement in, they have their policies, but it's not really, there's not really legislation that's governing how this is working.
I was going to say, it seems like public policy seems to really lag behind. I suppose that's with any technological advance, but it doesn't even seem to be in the discussion at this point.
Yeah, there's not really much in the way of any kind of regulation. I mean, this field in general is not heavily regulated, or it's the opposite of heavily regulated. And that's, that's how we do it. That's how it is here. So, but you're starting to see, more in the way, little bits and pieces from states who are trying to enact protections against things like genetic discrimination, or trying to account for seeing around corners in ways that are very difficult, because, as you say, the technology leads and then the regulation follows far behind.
One issue I wanted to ask about has to do with issues surrounding home DNA testing for African American community, particularly in the context of the history of slavery in America, and what that looks like when the DNA results come back. Whether things that are expected and things that are unexpected. What's if you could just summarize that briefly?
Yeah, so the particular, part of what's important to know, and genealogists who are here will know this already, that that there's a relationship between record keeping and privilege and power. So if a community is wealthier, if they're literate, historically, if their records were preserved, if they were taken down in the first place, and then if they were preserved and not destroyed, all those things can really help a community trace its roots. And the opposite is true. So, for instance, people who are descended from those who were enslaved can have a heck of a time tracing back their genealogical histories, because just as a for instance, if you're looking back at your ancestors before 1870, they're not going to show up in the federal census before then, because slaves were not named in the federal census. So they would just be like a tick mark. And so if you're searching for a particular ancestor, you're going to slam right into a brick wall at that point. And so, one of the things that I tried to kind of document and understand was how, African-American genealogists have used DNA testing to get around, to make an end run around that lack of records. And I tell a few stories in the book of people really being able to get their hands on the history. One story I tell is about someone who does their research and really is much better able to understand the lives of their ancestors in this country. And another story I tell is about a genealogist who's able to really understand several branches of his tree back before enslavement. He finds, in fact, a present day cousin in Africa. And that find within the database. And that find is so incredible because not only is his ethnicity estimate, right, telling him with some precision where his people came from, and of course those results can be not perfect, but they're subject to updates, and they often generally tend to get better over time. But then the fact of this cousin in the database means that he can then reach out to that person, and that person can say, here's who our people were. And that person is able to actually tell him where they came from. And it was a particular community, the Fulani people. And then this genealogist can go and look up who these people were, what their language was, the customs, how they lived. And that gives him so much incredible access that he would never have been able to get outside of DNA. Outside of DNA, he would have just been hitting this brick wall.
Yeah. I'm going to ask now, we're at about almost 3/4 of the way through. If anyone has any questions, they can type questions in the little control panel area where they say questions. You also have the ability to raise your hand, click the icon for that. So if I see a raised hand, then I can actually unmute your mic. So now is the time for questions if you want to formulate those. In the meantime, while we're pondering that, what would you say is the biggest misconception people have about home DNA testing? I'm sure there are a few, but what's one of the more common ones?
That's a good question. I think one misconception people have, and I'm getting some feedback, but hopefully it sounds like it's disappearing, so it's okay. One misconception I think people have is that they think that they're going to test and the results are going to give them all the information they need to know, right? And they may not even go in with that precise of a sense of what they're expecting it to tell them, but they're just expecting it to tell them lots of stuff. And it can't tell you lots of stuff because you have to do some work with the results that you get. DNA in isolation is of some value, but it's of limited value unless you're using it in conjunction with genealogical research. You have to pair those two things in order to understand the nature of the relationships that you're seeing if you're looking at your genetic cousins. So that's a really important thing. Another thing to think about is, there's this kind of famous ancestry ad that I love to cite that used to be on the air a bunch a few years ago, and it's called the Kyle ad. And it's a guy named Kyle, and he says, I used to think I was one thing and I turned out to be another. I took a DNA test and I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt. And you see him first in lederhosen and then he's in a kilt, and it turns out he's like not German, he's Scottish. I think I have that right. And the idea is like as if a lifetime experiences and one's understanding one's culture could be like taken off and put on as easily as like a costume. And I mean, the reality is like, yes, those things are important to our sense of self, but they're also like not the whole picture by like a major stretch, right? And so it's both things, right? It's like the way that your lifetime's experiences have informed you, like the language and the food that you grew up with. That is also ethnicity. It is not just genetic ancestry. And what I found was that most people do understand this if they've gone through the process. So we may go in, with perhaps a kind of a facile idea of what we're going to find. But the reality is, like, we then resolve these conflicts with a great deal of nuance, I found. And a number of people found themselves kind of in between, and they talk about that. So they grew up with an understanding that they were one thing. They discovered they were not at all that thing, but they were something else instead. And then they found themselves in this process of reconciliation that can be really quite deep. And that was one of the main things that I was interested in exploring. Again, through these human stories, these intimate stories, because I think, these questions about the human condition, right? How do we decide who we are? Where does that information come from? How do we resolve these conflicts?
I have a few questions from the attendees. One that I think is going to be a quick one, and then a couple lengthier ones. The first one has to do asking what the name of the site is that you can compare the DNA. I assume they're asking about that third-party site where you can upload your results. What was the name of that?
Yeah, it's called GED GED Match.
GED Match.
Yeah, and that's a site where you can compare information from somebody who tested at another database if they've also uploaded it. So that's a small universe of people. This is not a huge site, like a site for people who are really deep into this hobby. So you're going to get a very limited pool of people there. But if you know someone, and they tested someplace else, you can both upload there and then you could compare. There's also a lot of tools there, really cool tools. That, again, someone like me who's a journalist and not a genetic genealogist, most of it would be over my head. But if you're deep into this stuff, like you really understand it, you can get really into it. It's quite wonderful.
Interesting. A related question, someone asks, am I correct in understanding that someone looking for other family through DNA would require that someone else in the potential family would also have had a test in order to tie the two together?
Yes, but you might not need the person that you think, right? So if you're looking to figure out, for instance, if you're looking to figure out, the identity of a genetic parent, you don't need that particular parent to be in the system, right? You need that person's sister or brother or first cousin or second cousin or potentially third cousin. Now, that's not necessarily, piecing it together from a third cousin is not going to be easy and you might need help, but these days you're very likely to get a much closer match. And so you do need someone from that family, but the definition of that family, think about how many third cousins you have. I don't know what the statistic is, but it's like a lot, right? You have a lot of third cousins that you don't even know are in your family. So there's a high likelihood, I would say, that somebody from that family has tested. Ancestry at this point says that if you test with them, you are on average going to get 50,000 genetic cousins. 50,000.
Wow.
So it's not like you can just kind of be like, well, there's nobody, I'm opting out and like my family. No, you're there, right? Like you're going to find people. There's no question about it. There are some communities who are more well represented than others, but you're going to be able to find at the very least, some not so close cousins, and quite possibly some closer ones as well, if not actual, half siblings, or parents, aunts and uncles.
Another question we have is, do you think DNA testing will affect or change how we think about race?
That is such a good question. It's such a good question that I devoted a whole chapter to it. Actually, two. So I am hopeful, but it's coming more from a place of hope than it is from a place of fact that it's going to make us better about race in terms of seeing the commonalities, because I'm hoping that it will kind of raise our awareness about how identical we are, right? So we are 99.5% identical. A fact that we human beings to one another. A fact that can be obscured by those ethnicity estimates, because what they tend to suggest is a great difference, so many distinctions that they can tell with great precision down to 22.3% of a difference that you are like this percent Swedish, or this percent Korean. In fact, we are all kind of on a continuum, and there's great similarities, and it's not as if those particular differences, when viewed in isolation, belong to just one ethnicity or just one race. So, so there's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania who's done research looking at this question of, do these pie charts that you get, do they reinforce our sense of difference from one another, our sense that there's something essentially white and essentially black, and that they're very divided and very different? So does it reify race, is the phrase that she uses, or does it break down that sense of difference and sort of make us see our commonalities and our common brotherhood and sisterhood? And she found that the answer was both. And the key difference appears to be genetic literacy. So depending on how much knowledge you go into a test with, will help determine where you land. So if you go in with more of an understanding of what these tests are looking at and what they can't really tell you, you're going to walk away with more of a sense of commonality. And the opposite seems to be true if you're going in with low genetic literacy. So that's all kind of one bucket. And then I'll sort of finish this long thing by saying the interviews I've done with people who found that they, that they were kind of more diverse in their ancestral backgrounds than they realized, or that they, that they were, they had a kind of a conflict between their family narratives and their actual genetic ancestry, and how were they going to resolve that? The nuance that they brought to those understandings of self, the way that they said, yes, I am this and I'm that, not I'm taking off my lederhosen and putting on a kilt, but I am both things, I'm claiming both. The nuance that people came to answering that question with, I found gave me a sense of hope that maybe we can be pretty kind of smart and complex in how we think about these things, and not fall into these easy kind of traps about that accentuate difference beyond what in fact genes can actually tell us.
I have a couple other questions. One, just a quick question. Someone wants a definition of third cousin, and we can do that one real quick if you like.
So a first cousin means that you share a set of grandparents, and a second cousin means that you share great-grandparents, and a third cousin, great-great-grandparents. Did I get that right, Charlie? I think so, right? And a first cousin once removed is a first cousin, just, you didn't ask, but I'm just going to keep going. A first cousin once removed is like a first cousin, but with like one generational difference. So for instance, if your first cousin has a child, that's your first cousin once removed. So I hope that helps. And I hope I got it right.
I've got a couple other good questions here. I'm deciding which order I want to do these in. For the person that asked theirs earlier, I'll get to that, but I'm going to do the one on do the testing services exaggerate how specific, how accurate those percentages are when they say you're 29.37% Irish.
Yes.
What exactly
Yeah, I mean,
does that mean? I mean,
so,
we know
yeah,
how people interpret it, but what does that actually mean?
so those the relative predictions are really reliable. They can't always predict the nature of the relationship, but they can predict the degree of relationship. So if they're telling you have a close relative, that's a close relative. Um, what the ethnicity estimates are different, and you have to take them with a grain of salt because they are kind of an evolving science. There's some interpretation going on there based on a few factors. And you'll notice that you'll get like these updates every 6 months and your results will change. Well, how can that be? And it's that this is evolving, and there's all sorts of reasons why it's hard to make these predictions, and they are estimates. And so on the one hand, I think the companies do a good job because they do call them estimates. And you can even on some of them play with like there's one company has like a confidence slider where you can kind of like play with it and see what it would look like if you put it at a very low confidence, how it kind of broadens out and gives you less specificity. On the other hand, sometimes the numbers that they give you are so precise, right? 20, like I was saying, 23.2%. It suggests a level of specificity and precision that they simply can't deliver on. And that's a bit of a problem. And, you will find that there are these, results on the margins that will disappear. So there was a period of time where I was 1% Korean. And again, that the precision of that 1% seemed so very precise that I remember sitting there, this was years ago, with my mom, and we were looking at the results, and it was saying, the 1% indicates that, you would have had an ancestor sometime, I think it was like the 1700s. And so we were trying to imagine how this Korean ancestor intersected. On my mom's side, we're Ashkenazi Jews. How did this Korean ancestor intersect with my Ashkenazi Jewish forebears? We were inventing all kinds of stories for it. It was really, really fun. And then a few months later, I got an ethnicity estimate, and my Korean results were downgraded to 0.1% South Asian. And I thought, And I was, by that point, I was actually doing interviews for the book, and I interviewed one of the scientific advisors at, I think the company was 23andMe, and he said, that's going to disappear pretty soon. That's just noise. And it did.
Interesting.
Yeah. So for sure, I mean, you have to take these with a grain of salt. They have difficulty telling, for instance, the difference between French and German, because those, communities were close together geographically and genetically. There's all sorts of definitional issues having to do with, nation states that didn't have the same names and the same borders 500 years ago. So how can you say, what is Germany, right? At that point in time, have a concept of it now, but and there's all sorts of, it's not as if there's a nation state territory that people don't cross over and marry, between, right? So it's not as if there are these sort of sharp lines that can delineate one group of people from another. And so you do definitely have to take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think the misconception that I see the most in the genetic or the ethnic breakdowns is the fact that, and they say it in the results, that, this DNA matches people from this area. It doesn't mean that you're descended. So the fact that one half of my family is Norwegian, but we show up in the DNA as a quarter English because those populations, because of historic interactions, share that DNA. So I think that's one thing that they do a better job of communicating that. The question that I was putting off, because it's a really big one and it's a good one, someone is asking for advice for a relative who becomes the mediator between a found relative who the family did not know about and the family they discovered through DNA. Are there best practices on how to introduce that new person into the family? That's a pretty easy one, I know.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I still remember the first book event I did, which was before the pandemic hit by about a week, because my book came out in March. I was at a book event in Baltimore, and I was talking, and a woman in the audience raised her hand and she said, I'm the mediator, in my family, and what the heck am I supposed to do? And she actually had tears in her eyes, because she was in a really tough situation where she was basically, you know, she knew that her brother was not genetically related to her niece, because of the results that she had seen in the DNA databases. I don't know if she was managing a kit or what the situation was. And she had been put in the position of having to like have this knowledge and then know whether or not she should pass it on. And I thought, man, this is like untenable, right? Like how is it that we have these people in these situations where they're having to act as bioethicists when we're none of us bioethicists, most of us at least, I'm not, we weren't trained for this, and how the heck are we supposed to manage this? So I would say, probably as a journalist rather than a genetic genealogist or search angel, I don't want to like give advice and be wrong. But I will say, there are a few factors that I found over and over helped people with their kind of coming together with genetic family. Agency and time. And so agency means that you are in charge of your own search and the decision about how the information comes to you and the pace at which it comes to you. And time means that you are allowed to dictate the timeline. And sometimes people are on two different timelines. So very often the seeker, the person who's reaching out, very often this is an adult child of an NPE, they often, not always, but often, at least in my interviews, wanted it sooner rather than later. They wanted that connection sooner rather than later, and they wanted to be kind of like accepted and given information, and they wanted photographs and stories. And very often the people on the other side, which would be, say, the father and his wife, and potentially the children that he raised within that marriage, would feel threatened by this, this stranger who is actually genetically related to them coming in, and they would sometimes respond with things like, what does she want? What does he want? Are they a gold digger, right? And that was never at least in the cases I saw, that was never the impetus, but there was this kind of sense of distrust. And so, the important thing for the seeker, and I don't know how this plays into this questioner's balancing act, but something to keep in mind as she or he is mediating, is that the seeker may be on a different timeline, a more urgent timeline, and that in order for things to play out, it may be a situation where it has to go a bit slower in order for it to be well received by everyone. And the information, in terms of how that information is communicated about the identity and the background, how this came to be, very often that is something that you kind of have to let the person who is most reluctant ask for that information, give them a little bit, right? I found this close connection in the DNA databases. Do you want to know more? And then let them say, what kind of relationship is this? What do you mean? And let it kind of go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We're actually at the end of our time, so I want to thank everyone for their comments, and I want to thank you for your time, Libby. I do have one last question. You have written, I know you've been living DNA for the last few years, but you've written on things from home DNA testing to home funerals, gender marketing of diet soda and automobiles, and Glenn Beck's line of blue jeans, and urban raccoons, which fascinate me. So what is next for you? What's on the horizon after you take a break from the DNA?
So for now, I'm just doing this, and I have a regular monthly column at Psychology Today, and I actually just published the latest column today, if you want to check that out. I have a newsletter where I write about this stuff, which you can sign up for at my website. Sorry, I'm suddenly you asked, so I'm just blah, blah, blah. But yes, you can sign up at my website, which is libbycopeland.com. And I'm just kind of hearing stories from people. People reach out to me, and I'm sort of, I'm writing about this topic. I think it's really important. And I'm not ready to sort of say, okay, because I think it's getting bigger with each passing year. I think it's incredibly important. And the last thing I want to say, if people are interested, is, one of the beauties, but also regrets of doing these virtual events. The beauty is I can be with you, and I'm actually not there. And the regret is like I can't sign books, and that's something that I love to do, and I got to do a little bit of, and then I had to stop. So because I love that, I have a relationship with a bookstore in New York near my house, and it's called the Village Bookstore, and it's in Pleasantville, New York, and I can sign books there. And they can ship them anywhere in the country. So if you want a signed, personalized copy of the book, which is something you really can't get unless you go to a book event, or you want it made out to someone as a gift, you can call the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York, and I will run over there and sign books.
I put that information in a chat out to everyone. It's not the easiest to read, I'll be honest. So what I will do is send that information out via email to all the attendees and registrants tomorrow. So, as well as the links to where you can, if you just want to buy the book through one of the big online booksellers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and I'm drawing a blank on the third.
Which bookshops support independent bookstores, which is a great thing to do if you can.
Great.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the one I blanked on. But yes, I will send all that information out tomorrow. So it's been, I also want to put in a plug for your Facebook page because it has many links to like your Psychology Today columns and such. There's a lot of interesting reading and videos on there. So thank you very much, Libby. It's been fascinating. For those of you who have attended that were just kind of interested and haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend it. It's a really fascinating read. And as you said, it sort of opens up questions that aren't going to be answered for quite some time. So it's a really rich subject for study and thought. So thank you very much, Libby.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and I loved being in conversation with you, Charlie. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Well, I will say good night to everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night.